Karen Wilkins, the self-appointed queen of her Homeowners Association, HOA, was seething with rage as she stared at the heavy chain and lock barricading the entrance to the community ranch. Her perfectly manicured brows furrowed in a scowl, and her perfectly highlighted hair seemed to bristle with her mounting frustration. "How dare they?" she muttered under her breath, her perfectly glossed lips pursed in a thin line. Karen had spent years asserting her dominance over the HOA, bullying her neighbors into compliance with her endless list of petty rules and regulations. But this was a blatant act of defiance that she simply could not tolerate. Without hesitation, Karen whipped out her phone and dialed 911, her perfectly manicured nails tapping furiously against the screen. "Yes, hello. This is Karen Wilkins from the Serenity Hills HOA," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "There's been a security breach at the community ranch, and I need the police here immediately." Little did Karen know, the person responsible for the barricade was none other than her own neighbor, Detective Robert Hawkins, who was working undercover to investigate a series of break-ins that had been plaguing the community. Robert had set up the chain and lock as a trap, hoping to catch the culprit in the act. As the minutes ticked by, Karen's frustration only grew. She paced back and forth in front of the barricade, her designer heels clicking against the pavement with each step. "Where are those incompetent officers?" she muttered, glancing anxiously at her phone. Finally, the familiar sound of sirens pierced the air, and Karen straightened her posture, ready to deliver her dramatic monologue to the arriving police. But when the patrol car pulled up, the officer who emerged was none other than Detective Hawkins himself, his face a mask of stoic professionalism. "Ma'am, what seems to be the problem?" he asked, his voice calm and even. Karen's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment she was at a loss for words. "Detective Hawkins," she stammered, her perfectly rehearsed script suddenly forgotten. "But I call for backup. There's been a security breach." The detective raised a single eyebrow, his expression unwavering. "I'm afraid that's not the case, Mrs. Wilkins," he said, his tone broking no argument. "I've been investigating a series of break-ins in the community, and I set up this barricade as a trap to catch the culprit." Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, and she felt the heat creeping up her neck. But I have a right to access the ranch," she protested, her voice rising in pitch. "As the HOA president, I demand that you remove this barricade immediately." Detective Hawkins regarded her coolly, his arms crossed over his chest. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Mrs. Wilkins," he said. "This is an active investigation, and the barricade stays in place until I've apprehended the suspect." Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish out of water, as she struggled to find the right words to express her outrage. Finally, she let out a frustrated huff and turned on her heel, stopping away in a cloud of designer perfume and righteous indignation. The following day, Karen Wilkins was back at the barricaded entrance to the community ranch, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the chain in an impatient rhythm. She had spent a restless night, her mind spinning with scenarios of how she could outsmart the infuriating Detective Hawkins and regain control of the situation. As the morning sun rose higher in the sky, Karen spotted a familiar figure approaching. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, another member of the HOA board. Karen straightened her posture, a sly smile spreading across her lips. "Mrs. Peterson, so good of you to join me," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Mrs. Peterson eyed the barricade warily, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Karen, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Oh, it's a terrible situation," Karen lamented, shaking her head in an exaggerated display of distress. "The community ranch has been breached, and the police have set up this barricade as part of their investigation. But as the HOA president, I simply must have access to the ranch. It's crucial for our community events and activities." Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened, and she glanced nervously at the chain and lock. "Well, that does sound quite problematic," she said, her voice hesitant. "Have you spoken to the police about this?" Karen nodded emphatically. Of course," she said, waving a dismissive hand. But that incompetent Detective Hawkins refuses to budge. He claims it's all part of his investigation, but I suspect he's just trying to assert his authority over me. Mrs. Peterson frowned, her brow furrowing in concern. Well, I certainly understand your frustration, Karen, she said, her voice cautious. But perhaps we should try to work with the police rather than against them. After all, they're here to protect our community. Karen's eyes narrowed, and her lips tightened into a thin line. Work with the police, she scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. Absolutely not. This is my community, and I will not stand idly by while some overzealous cop tries to dictate how we run things. Mrs. Peterson opened her mouth to protest, but Karen cut her off with a raised hand. No, Mrs. Peterson, this is where I draw the line, she said, her voice cold and unyielding. If you're not willing to stand with me, then you're against me, and that's a position I simply cannot tolerate. With those words, Karen turned on her heel and stormed away, leaving a bewildered Mrs. Peterson in her wake. The HOA was about to become a battleground, and Karen Wilkins was determined to emerge victorious, no matter the cost. As the days passed, Karen's crusade against the barricade and Detective Hawkins only intensified. She had taken to standing vigil at the entrance to the community ranch, her arms crossed defiantly over her chest as she glared at the offending chain and lock. Word of the standoff quickly spread through the neighborhood, and soon a small crowd of curious onlookers began to gather. Drawn by the promise of drama and intrigue, Karen, ever the consummate performer, seized the opportunity to rally her neighbors to her cause. This is an outrage, she proclaimed, her voice carrying across the crowd. Our community ranch is supposed to be a place of peace and tranquility, a haven for our families and children. And yet, this so-called detective has the audacity to block our access, all in the name of his precious investigation. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Karen could see the glimmers of rebellion in their eyes. Well, I for one will not stand idly by and let this happen, she continued, her voice rising in pitch. This is our community, and we have a right to use and enjoy our own facilities. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and Karen felt a surge of triumph. She had always known how to play to her audience, and now, it seemed, her neighbors were firmly on her side. But as Karen basked in the adulation of the crowd, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows, Detective Hawkins, his face set in a stern expression. Mrs. Wilkins, I'm going to have to ask you and your neighbors to disperse, he said, his voice calm but unyielding. This is an active investigation, and I can't have you interfering with my work. Karen's eyes narrowed, and she stepped forward, her perfectly manicured finger pointed accusingly at the detective. Oh, we'll disperse all right, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. But not until you remove that barricade and give us back our access to the ranch. The crowd erupted in a chorus of shouts and boos, and Karen couldn't help but feel the sense of triumph. She had rallied her neighbors to her cause, and now they were willing to stand up to the police in defense of their community. But as the tension in the air thickened, Karen couldn't help but wonder, had she bitten off more than she could chew? The standoff between Karen Wilkins and Detective Hawkins showed no signs of abating. As the days turned into weeks, the small crowd of onlookers had swelled into a full-fledged mob, with more and more of Karen's neighbors joining the protest against the barricade. Karen, ever the consummate organizer, had rallied her troops with a series of impassioned speeches, painting the detective as a tyrannical interloper who was robbing the community of its rightful access to the ranch. The more she spoke, the more the crowd's anger seemed to simmer, and the tension in the air grew palpable. Detective Hawkins, for his part, remained steadfast in his refusal to remove the barricade. He had tried to reason with Karen and her neighbors, explaining the importance of his investigation and the need to maintain the integrity of the crime scene. But his pleas fell on deaf ears, as Karen and her supporters refused to back down. One particularly tense afternoon, the standoff reached a boiling point. Karen, her face flushed with anger, stood defiantly in front of the barricade, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the palms of her hands. This is our community, Detective Hawkins, she spat, her voice dripping with venom. and we won't be bullied by some overzealous cop who thinks he can just waltz in and take over." The crowd roared in agreement, the sound echoing through the streets like the rumble of distant thunder. Detective Hawkins held up a hand, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Wilkins, I understand your frustration, but I can't simply remove the barricade. This is an active investigation, and the safety of the community is my top priority." Karen's lips curled into a sneer. "Safety, huh?" she scoffed. "Well, let me tell you something, detective. The only thing that's threatening the safety of this community is your refusal to listen to the will of the people." Without warning, Karen turned to the crowd and gestured wildly. "What do you say, folks? Are we going to let this detective push us around any longer?" The crowd erupted in a deafening roar, and in the blink of an eye, they surged forward, surrounding the barricade and the lone detective who stood guard. Detective Hawkins tensed, his hand reaching instinctively for his holstered weapon. "Mrs. Wilkins, I'm warning you. This is your last chance to disperse. If you don't, I'll have no choice but to take action." Karen's eyes gleamed with triumph, and she stepped closer to the detective, her voice low and dangerous. "Oh, we're not going anywhere, detective. This is our community, and we're here to stay." The air crackled with tension, and the crowd pressed in closer, their shouts and jeers drowning out the sound of the detective's voice. It was clear that the standoff was about to take a dangerous turn, and Karen couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. She was finally in control, and no one, not even the police, could stop her. As the tension reached a fever pitch, a sudden movement in the crowd caught Karen's eye. She turned just in time to see a young man, his face contorted with rage, lunge forward towards Detective Hawkins. Without hesitation, the detective drew his weapon, his voice booming over the din of the crowd. "Stop right there. I'll shoot if you don't back off." The crowd fell silent, frozen in a moment of stunned disbelief. Karen's heart raced, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the palms of her hands. In the brief moment of calm, Detective Hawkins seized the opportunity. "All right, everyone, listen up," he shouted, his voice commanding. "This is an unlawful assembly, and I'm ordering you all to disperse immediately. If you don't, you'll be subject to arrest." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she stepped forward, her voice dripping with false bravado. "You can't do that, detective. We have a right to assemble and protest, and you can't just—" But before she could finish her sentence, the sound of sirens pierced the air, and a convoy of police cars came rushing into the scene. Within moments, the crowd was surrounded, and officers began to move in, shouting orders and making arrests. Karen watched in horror as her neighbors, her loyal supporters, were apprehended one by one. She turned to Detective Hawkins, her eyes wide with panic. "You can't do this. This is our community, and we have a right to—" "Cut the crap, Karen," the detective interrupted, his voice cold and unyielding. "You and your little band of troublemakers have been interfering with a police investigation, and that's a crime. Now, I'm going to give you one last chance to back off and go home, or you're going to find yourself in the back of a police car, just like the rest of them." Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. She could feel the weight of defeat settling on her shoulders, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless. Reluctantly, she turned and began to walk away, her high heels clicking against the pavement. As she went, she could hear the sound of her neighbors being read their rights, their voices raised in protest. And in that moment, Karen couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret. Had she taken things too far? As Karen walked away from the scene of the arrest, her mind raced with a million thoughts. She had always prided herself on her ability to manipulate and control the people around her. But this time, she had clearly bitten off more than she could chew. The image of her neighbors being hauled away in handcuffs was seared into her memory, and she couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that had begun to creep into her conscience. After all, it was her rallying cry that had brought them to this point, her insistence on standing up to the police that had put them in jeopardy. As she walked, Karen's perfectly manicured steps became more and more unsteady, her confidence slowly giving way to a growing sense of doubt and unease. She had always thought of herself as the master of her own destiny, the queen of her little kingdom, But now she was forced to confront the reality that she was not as invincible as she had believed. Reaching her car, Karen fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and trepidation. She slid behind the wheel, her eyes fixed straight ahead, and for a moment, she simply sat there, her mind completely blank. It was only when she heard the sound of the police sirens fading into the distance that she finally allowed herself to exhale. A ragged breath escaping her lips, she had always prided herself on her ability to remain calm and collected in the face of adversity, but right now she felt like she was losing her grip on everything. Slowly, Karen turned her key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she couldn't help but glance back at the scene of the arrests, a pang of guilt and remorse tugging at her heart. For the first time in her life, Karen Wilkins was forced to confront the consequences of her own actions. She had let her pride and her desire for control cloud her judgment, and now she was paying the price. The question was, would she be able to find a way to redeem herself, or would this be the end of her reign as the queen of the Serenity Hills HOA? As she drove home, Karen's mind raced with possibilities, each one more far-fetched than the last. She knew that she had to do something, to make things right, but the weight of her mistakes was heavy, and she wasn't sure where to even begin. One thing was certain, though. This was a reckoning that she could no longer avoid. The time had come for Karen Wilkins to face the music, and she had a feeling that it was going to be a very, very long night. As Karen Wilkins sat alone in her lavish living room, the weight of her mistakes began to sink in. She had spent countless hours poring over the details of the incident, replaying the events in her mind, searching for a way to undo the damage she had caused. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that there was no easy solution. Her neighbors had been arrested, and the community's trust in her had been shattered. She had single-handedly turned Serenity Hills HOA into a battleground, and the consequences were now staring her in the face. Still, Karen was never one to give up easily. She was a fighter, a survivor, and she was determined to claw her way back to the top. But this time, she knew she couldn't rely on her usual tactics of bullying and manipulation. She needed a new approach, one that would allow her to regain the trust and respect of her community. As she sat in the dimly lit room, Karen's eyes suddenly brightened with a spark of inspiration. She reached for her phone, her fingers dancing across the screen as she began to formulate a plan. First, she would need to reach out to the families of the arrested neighbors, offering her sincere apologies and vowing to do everything in her power to have their charges dropped. It wouldn't be easy, and she knew that many of them would be hesitant to trust her, but she was willing to swallow her pride and make amends. Next, she would need to find a way to repair the damage she had done to the HOA's reputation. Perhaps she could organize a community event, something that would bring the neighborhood together and remind them of the positive impact the HOA could have. And then, of course, there was the matter of Detective Hawkins. Karen knew that she would need to find a way to work with him, rather than against him, if she wanted to regain control of the situation. Perhaps she could offer to assist with his investigation, using her connections and influence to help him track down the real culprit. As Karen's plan began to take shape, a sense of determination settled over her. She was no longer the queen of her little kingdom, but she was determined to reclaim her throne. This time, however, she would do it with a softer touch, her focus on building bridges rather than burning them. With a newfound resolve, Karen stood up and began to make her calls, her voice steady and confident. She was about to embark on the fight of her life, and she was determined to emerge victorious. Over the next few weeks, Karen Wilkins embarked on a relentless campaign to redeem herself and restore her standing within the Serenity Hills community. She reached out to the families of the arrested neighbors, offering her sincere apologies and vowing to do everything in her power to have their charges dropped. To her surprise, many of the neighbors were receptive to her overtures, sensing a genuine change in her demeanor. Karen had shed her usual abrasive and domineering attitude, instead approaching them with humility and a genuine desire to make amends. Simultaneously, Karen worked closely with Detective Hawkins, offering her connections and resources to assist with his investigation. The detective, initially skeptical of her motives, soon began to see a different side of the once formidable HOA president. Together, they uncovered the true culprit behind the break-ins, a disgruntled former employee of the community's landscaping company. With Karen's help, the detective was able to quickly apprehend the suspect, much to the relief of the entire neighborhood. As the charges against the arrested neighbors were dropped, a sense of cautious optimism began to spread throughout Serenity Hills. Karen's willingness to take responsibility for her actions and work towards a resolution had not gone unnoticed. And slowly but surely, she began to regain the trust and respect of her community. But the true test came when it was time for the annual HOA election. Karen, unsure of her standing, decided to run for re-election, fully aware that she would need to prove herself worthy of the community's support. To her surprise, the election was a landslide victory, with Karen winning by a wide margin. Her neighbors, impressed by her newfound humility and dedication to the community, had decided to give her another chance. As Karen stood at the podium, addressing the cheering crowd, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and relief. She had weathered the storm, emerging from the ashes of her own hubris, and she was now ready to lead the Serenity Hills HOA with a renewed sense of purpose and commitment. In the end, Karen's journey had been a humbling one, a stark reminder that true leadership is not about wielding power, but about serving the community with empathy, integrity, and a genuine desire to make a positive difference. And as she looked out over the crowd, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would forever change the way she approached her role as the queen of the HOA.